I think that the pharmaceutical industry still is not capitalizing on the great good that it does. I would actually claim that the biotech industry, as we know today, would not exist without CROs. By that time, we worked mainly, almost exclusively with the top 10 pharma companies. I believe to this day that we had the best people in the industry, and I can tell you to this day, the entire industry is seeded with talent from Parexel. Do you know how long it took until we got rid of paper? The last trial at Parexel that still had paper was in 2017. When we started to do clinical trials in the East, meaning Eastern Europe, we had to bring printers, fax machines, computers to the doctors. They had nothing because a lot is at stake. This is not just money. It's not just like any other commodity. Really, people's lives are at stake. I always viewed myself as an athlete. And if you want to compete at the highest level, you have to be willing to do what athletes do. Success in entrepreneurship is tenacity. You have to stick with it.
Today is a really special episode. I'm joined by one of the founders of Parexel. Joe started the company in 1982, and he spent 36 years as CEO, growing the company to almost 20,000 people. Interestingly, Parexel was the first to define what a CRO industry actually is in the 90s when IPO. I spoke with Joe for about an hour and a half, but generally I could have spent many more hours because the wisdom, the passion, the tenacity that Joe has for the work that was done is absolutely inspiring. I hope it inspires you, and enjoy. Joe, welcome to the episode.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So take us back to your beginning. You grew up in Switzerland originally. How did that experience shape the way that you are?
You're correct. I did grow up in Switzerland, in central Switzerland. So this is in the mountains. And without the question, it shapes you for life. The basic values and your childhood and just kind of the grounding for the rest of your existence basically happens in your youth. And that happened in Switzerland for me.
And you went on to study at Lucerne and then Harvard. Tell us a little bit about how those places were back then and how that helped you or maybe not even, maybe didn't help you in building in your work.
Yes. So at that time, actually, the University of Lucerne didn't exist. There were separate schools that weren't amalgamated yet. And I went to basically a business economics school, which was part of basically a polytech, you could say. Eventually, this was all subsumed into the University of Lucerne. And after I graduated there, I went to work for Schering-Plough in Lucerne, in Switzerland, which is roughly, my family is, from that area, from central Switzerland. And so my first experience in the pharmaceutical industry was in Lucerne with Schering-Plough.
And back then, the CRO industry didn't exist.
The CRO industry didn't exist. I had really also I didn't really think about that. I mean, coincidentally, I was actually on the commercial side of the pharma company there, and coincidentally, the clinical research department was on the same floor as we were, and so I had a little bit of a discourse with them and an interaction. And one of the things that really dawned on me while I was there is just how important the U.S. is in the pharmaceutical business and in business overall. And
this was in the 70s?
This was in the late 70s. Mid-70s. And the setup there in Lucerne was actually the headquarters for Schering-Plough for Europe and the Middle East and Africa. Yeah. So the whole EMEA region. And so we had a lot of interactions with headquarters and with senior people. And I basically realized that most of them had American degrees and MBAs. And so eventually that led me to Harvard. I applied there and, to my surprise, actually, I was accepted.
Yeah. And that was the first time you moved, and you stayed in the US ever since.
Yeah, so this was then in the late 70s. So we came here to Boston. I'm still here in Boston. And we got married. My wife and I.
Your wife came with you?
Well, we got married 2 weeks before we came.
Okay, right.
So, actually, the Harvard Business School was sort of our honeymoon, which she still talks about. And we really had no plans to stay here whatsoever.
Yeah. Wow.
We were...
You were going to move back after?
The happy Swiss, basically, exactly. Yeah. And we were just going to, move back and see this as a sort of an educational chapter in our lives and be done. And so, coming here was a huge experience, a huge eye-opener also.
What was the first impression you got, both in terms of, the country generally, but I guess more the business culture? You had an idea already experiencing some of the people that had studied here, but when you got here, was there something that attracted you to say, this might be for me?
Well, there are a number of things that are really important. One is, as a Swiss, as a European, you sort of had basically a Hollywood idea of America, okay? And so this was completely shattered on day one when you arrive in Boston, which is basically a settled and relatively old city, even by European standards. And so that's one thing. But then, the Harvard Business School experience was really fantastic. Right, it was a transformative, life-changing experience for me. And it opened my eyes in particular to the U.S. economy and the way of doing business in the U.S. And most importantly, to the importance of entrepreneurship, which in my background really before didn't exist at all.
Was there a particular conversation you had or someone you met that made you realize that, entrepreneurship is an actual a potential path? And I say this from experience. I never had a moment where I said, I want to become an entrepreneur. How was that gradual transition for you?
Well, so my initial intent was to go back and work for either Schering Plough or a company like that. And so this was, a gradual interest that I developed while I was at Harvard, which is actually somewhat unusual because generally, certainly at that time, they were educating young leaders for big companies.
And I think what people also don't understand now is that the venture capital industry at the time was almost non-existent.
Was almost non-existent, except here in Boston, they had an ecosystem.
Right.
And so in any case, I was fascinated by this. And what the way this eventually came about, I really wanted to give this a try, but, it was obviously risky. And so it turned out one of the companies I interviewed with, a big company, absolutely was interested in me working for them. And I said, well, I'm not sure now, I'm more interested in smaller companies. And they basically said, okay, here's the deal. We'll give you an open letter. So if you ever change your mind in the next 2 years, you can basically show up and you have a job, a position. And I said, well, that's really cool. And so I ended up working after business school for a startup in Cambridge. And so that was my first kind of experience in entrepreneurship. And I still remember, the CEO had a bike in his office, which for me as a sort of a proper Swiss was basically unbelievable. He was also late for every interview. I might add that too. And, it was just a classical sort of, Harvard, MIT startup. Basically, they did everything for everybody, which was another thing that was very confusing for me. The purpose was not really clear. There were really no structures. It was all kind of fluid. And that was my first experience in an entrepreneurial setting.
And this is late 70s?
Yeah, so this is now early 80s.
Early 80s.
81.
So take us back to that I think you started it in 1982 with Anne.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about both the day one and sort of the moment or the period leading to that. Was it straight after this startup or?
Yeah, so I met Anne at this company. Yeah. So one thing this company had was unbelievable talent.
Right.
And so, here Boston is just amazing when it comes to talent. And that was already the case then. Yeah. Anne was, a senior person in every respect. She was a former professor at Yale in chemistry. She was extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily educated. I was just an extraordinary person. But she had also an interest in entrepreneurship. And so we kind of were peas in a pod. And I spun up this idea with her and, asked her whether she would join me. And she
You're
said,
still at the company at this?
We're still at the company, yeah. We had offices down and we actually worked on a project together. And she said, yes. So, which was really amazing, And I mean, I was very young and she could have been my mother,
Wow.
And in many ways, she was my biggest investor and my biggest teacher. She was a professor, at heart. Yeah. And she was a professor at Yale Medical School, really a polymath in many respects. And I learned a lot from her, really a lot.
And how was that period? So she said yes. It sounds like to your surprise.
Yeah.
Tell us about the period. You obviously had to leave at some point.
Yeah. And so what happened, the company I joined had some financial problems. They were heavily invested in, amongst many other things, in oil and energy. And so the oil price collapsed at the end of 81 into 82. And so they had some issues and some problems. And so, she and I basically said, okay, let's just leave. And so we had our idea. We basically started as a regulatory consulting company, an advisory firm for medium-sized European and Japanese companies
that wanted to get into the U.S.
Well, it turned out, you have to kind of get back to that time. So at that time, communications were very difficult. There was no internet, of course. You really only had the telephone, and the telephone call to Europe cost maybe $100 for 10 minutes. And so basically, people rarely did it. And in addition to that, you only had telex. Fax did not exist.
Remind our audience, what's a telex?
So a telex is essentially a typewriter. So you had a typewriter on each end of the people communicating, and the typewritten text was translated with a paper strip into digital signals, which were then transmitted over the phone line to the recipient. And they had a typewriter there, and it was essentially physically typed. The text was physically typed out at the recipient's end. So it's very clunky, also very expensive, but that is how people communicated. And when I say, I mean typewriter, I don't mean, so it was very noisy, very big, these were big machines. Really unbelievable, actually. But having said that, the reason why this is important is because small and medium-sized companies could not deal with the U.S. government. And many of these companies had interesting products which they would have liked to launch in the U.S., but they just could not deal with the regulations. And basically our value added was that this is mainly Anne, had the very good regulatory and technical knowledge about the U.S. and how to deal with the U.S. government. And so we essentially took their dossiers and got them ready for U.S. submissions. And so that's how we started.
And how do you go then if you're a two-person outfit to a company, even if it's not big pharma, and convince them to trust you?
Well, in the beginning, as I said, these were mainly small and medium-sized companies. So the division of labor was that Anne's job was basically to do the technical work, and I did everything else, from sales to financing to accounting to whatever else needs to happen, real estate, personnel issues, and so on. And, in the beginning, we didn't really have big pharma, but we had very quickly traction with medium-sized and small life sciences companies. They weren't really pharma companies necessarily, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, and also in Japan. Actually, our second paying customer was Mitsubishi.
Really? Oh, wow. You had to brush up on your Japanese, or?
Well, I didn't really learn Japanese, but I spent a lot of time in my life in Japan. That is absolutely true. I mean, it's not an easy feat, to sell to a Japanese company. But they were also struggling. And if you recall, in the early 80s, Japan was really a powerhouse economically. They were sort of the China of its day.
Yeah. And the name Parexel,
The name Parexel is a derivation of a Swiss alchemist called Paracelsus. And if you go back in history, Paracelsus was the guy in the late Middle Ages, in the beginning of the Renaissance, who basically threw out the old Galen medicine. So he didn't believe that health was derived or dependent on stars and fire and earth and all these other things that the Galen world had. And he basically believed that health was influenced by outside agents, that even if we can't see them. And in many ways, he started what eventually became experimentation. He actually did some very crude clinical trials. And so he was a big person, very revolutionary. So, with all that comes with that, with some good, some bad. But, and coincidentally, I grew up about 10 miles from where he lived.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so I thought this was a kind of a tribute to...
Yeah. But you're the one who came up with the story.
I did,
yeah.
Yes.
Fantastic. So let's go a bit forward. So we're in the 80s, mid to late 80s. Parexel's growing. Was there a moment or what was your thinking about this is actually going to be big? Was there a moment, was it gradual or?
I should say one other inspiration for me as far as entrepreneurship is concerned and growth was my wife's position. So she was an assistant to a Swedish startup which already had become very big and very international. And they had their headquarters in Switzerland also, and she worked for the founder. And so I had a little bit of from afar, an insight of how this worked. And I believed that we could eventually do what we did for the FDA everywhere. So in other words, it would be, going from first Europe and Japan to the US, but eventually also in the US. And so, almost from the beginning, we had this idea of a relatively international and therefore fairly substantive organization.
And was there any client or something that really took you to the next level, or how did that product offering, how did that develop?
Yeah, so what happened, so we got a fair amount of traction fairly quickly, within 2-3 years, and bigger companies and better products. We moved from basically excipients, if you want, more into drugs. And what we found was everybody for whom we worked, and remember, they wanted to get their products in the US, and so almost without exception, eventually they had to do clinical trials in the US. And they said, okay, this is really interesting. Thank you for doing this assessment. It's very good. How can we find somebody to do these clinical trials? And so we looked around. I looked around as part of my job, these kind of things. And it turned out there was nobody. Literally nobody.
This is mid-80s.
Yeah, this is mid-80s, exactly. Yeah. So still early 80s, so this would be 83, 84. And so I said to Anne, I think there is a market need here, because all clinical trials, commercial clinical trials happened inside large pharma companies. Yeah. There were no startups, by the way. There were very few biotech companies. There were some, but they were far from clinical trials. And so, and she really was not interested.
Oh, really?
She was not interested at all. She basically, I don't understand this. I'm a chemist, I'm a regulatory person. Yeah. I'm not a clinical trials person. This is a whole different, business, and it may be risky and so on, And she said, look, we basically achieved what we have here. And she enjoyed, of course, her position.
And how big was the company at the time?
We were probably... we probably had a dozen consultants, give or take. Yeah.
So how did you convince Anne to go for it?
Well, eventually I did an analysis, and I found that the economics were very attractive. And so at some point I said, Anne, look, I think we have to do this, and she was angry with me. She didn't talk to me for several weeks.
Oh, wow.
And
just because of the analysis, or
no, because she really was not on board. She really didn't want to do it. She didn't want to get into clinical research. But then, as it happened, as life sometimes worked out, one of her classmates from Harvard, she was a Harvard graduate, or actually from Radcliffe at that time, was the head of clinical research at a company called DuPont Merck. Okay, which doesn't exist anymore. It's basically a joint venture. And he became aware of the kind of work that we did, and he approached us, and he basically said, I have this clinical trial up at Yale where Anne used to be a professor at the medical school, and I need somebody to help me with this trial.
Wow.
And so she really couldn't turn this guy down.
Wow.
Okay,
Wow.
and I said, yes.
That's incredible.
And so that was
story.
our first trial.
That's okay.
I still remember it. The investigator was Dr. Cabin.
Yeah.
And of course, I jumped on this. I was the project manager.
Wow.
And, I learned this business really from the ground up, so I really learned every function, from statistics to data management to clinical monitoring to, whatever all these various aspects are from that trial forward.
That's an incredible story. Wow. So basically, founder friction is always a thing in startups, but it's fascinating how effectively just a chance in life effectively got the company to move in a certain direction. In this case, a trial. And so how I'm guessing it was a successful one. And
yeah, it was a successful one. It was a very simple trial. Today you would call it basically a phase 4 study. And I think in hindsight, they did a favor to Dr. Cabin. Of course, I didn't know this at the time.
Right.
But it was a real clinical trial, a full trial. And as I said, it was successful. And of course, I was also vindicated and encouraged by the work that we did and the experience. And, then we never looked back from then.
And at the time, did you take outside capital or was just yourself and Anne?
So one of the things I realized from that experience and from my business analysis is, I saw that we could not really bootstrap this. We really needed a step function of talent. Yeah. To do this right, we needed to attract an MD, basically, which we didn't have. And so we did go outside. I wrote a business plan. And eventually in 1986, it was as you said before, there were hardly any venture capitalists around. And certainly nobody who was interested in the service business.
Right.
They were basically glorified commercial bankers who were looking for collateral, and we didn't have any of that. It was essentially an idea, and they couldn't really deal with this. Just one episode, many companies came, many venture capitalists came to us, and one came with so many people for due diligence. They had more people looking at us than we had employees. We couldn't really fit them into the company.
That's insane.
And so in any case, most of them said no, but then eventually we got a round together in 1986. And, the lead investor there was a Boston company, Boston Capital Ventures. And specifically, the venture capitalist, the person, Dana Callow, stayed with the company as a director for 30 years.
30 years,
a long time.
Wow.
Yeah. And, basically went through all, the twists and turns of the growth of the company. But I will say it was a tough deal. It was a very, very tough deal by today's standards.
Why? What was it that made them say yes compared to everyone else?
I think they saw the opportunity. And, the way it really worked was we had already a commitment from a venture capitalist in Chicago. But that person knew more about the business a little bit, was a little more comfortable. But since he was not in Boston, he was looking for a lead investor in Boston.
Right.
And so they took some comfort from that. And then, once this came together, we were heavily oversubscribed for basically nothing. It was, we raised less than $1 million, and so we had like 4 or 5 venture capitalists that shared that, which is, it was almost a crowd. And by the way, it was very tough, because it became a full-time job for me to raise money, and I didn't neglected all my other duties, such as selling and getting new business. And so it was tough for the company.
And I think what in today's world, there's just so much information about how to do those things that, as an entrepreneur, you have to constantly learn. And at the time, how did you manage this constant?
It was necessity? It was very difficult because this didn't really exist. I had no role model. Right. I was really kind of making it up as you went along. But in the Boston area, the idea of venture capital and of entrepreneurship was more developed than probably anywhere else in the U.S., maybe in the absence of or in addition to the Bay Area as well. And so it was possible, but it was still very hard. You didn't really, as I said, you didn't have any role models really. And the playing field was heavily tilted in favor of capital.
And I think by today's standards, usually when you do a round, you give 15, 20, 25% to the investor. I think at the time it was a lot higher.
It was close to 100% for very little. And whatever you actually kept was an earn-in.
What is that? What is an earn-in?
An earn-in, you give them all the shares and you have to earn them back.
Right.
Which basically means chances are that they fire you and give it to your successor are very high. And so, clearly this has changed a lot. And I mean, as you know, I'm an investor today as well. And, there's just no comparison how, more favorable this now is for founding teams and for founders.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. And I think related to that, did you ever set out to say we're building an industry, or did you just opportunistically think there's a need and it just sort of happened that the industry of this, because you were one of the first, I believe, to really coin the term CRO. How did that come about?
Well, as I said, we were actually the first company that raised institutional venture capital.
Yeah.
So that was a relatively big deal in hindsight, because that community already, they all talk, did then, do now. They all compete, but they also all collaborate.
Yeah.
And so, it got a little bit of buzz. And it actually turned out, unbeknownst to us, there were two other companies that were also founded almost at the same time.
Yeah.
And these other two companies one was called Besselar. This company was founded by Hein Besselar, and he spun out of Merck, and he built a company called Besselar Associates. So it's a lot of name congruence there. But it was a successful company, and eventually that morphed into what became Covance.
Covance, yeah.
And the other company that was founded almost at the same time was Quintiles. And Quintiles basically came at this from the statistical side. It was, Dennis Skillings was the founder there, and he was statistics professor at the University of North Carolina, and obviously did a lot of work for pharma companies in statistics, biostatistics, data management. And so they kind of rolled it up from that end.
Fascinating. Now, you took Parexel public in 1995, which is, I think, 9 years after your first institutional round?
Yeah, correct.
Tell us about that. What's the first time you thought we have to go public? How did that process go?
Well, what happens, we then did several other rounds of venture capital. We grew a lot after we got that venture capital. We did hire an MD. We did hire basically a senior management team. And so by 1987, we had a really amazing team. In our second round of venture capital, I remember talking, having basically a session with a potential investor. And he said, I still remember this, on the way out. And he says, Joe, I don't understand what you're doing, but your people are so impressive. I believe you're going to figure it out, and I think you're going to be successful. And it was really true. We had a really, really world-class team already then. CFO, hired a CFO, chief medical officer. Our chief commercial officer was fantastic. Veronica Jordan was her name, British, and so on. Okay, so it was a very impressive team. We also immediately started to do acquisitions. With the first round, actually, it turns out we were able to, through quirks of circumstances, very favorable to us, we were able to acquire the biggest competitor of Quintiles in statistics. So we became a very important statistics and data management company very quickly also.
This is in 87.
This was in 87, correct. And remember, this was sort of at the beginning of the AIDS, or almost the heights of the AIDS crisis. And, one of the things that also happened was, the AIDS crisis caused big challenges for clinical research. And it turns out one of the big pharma companies spun out a separate entity for AIDS research, and they didn't want to use their own clinical research institution. And so they basically gave us the development for one of their compounds, with which we succeeded. So it was a very big job, very big opportunity, high visibility. And it really propelled us, to the forefront of clinical research, actually, very quickly through that call it an opportunity. It's sad, in terms of what happened, but eventually also led to the cures. And, we became an exclusive vendor to what was called ICAD, the Intercompany Consortium for AIDS Drug Research, AIDS drug development. And, that was, a big assignment for us and very prestigious. And we did a great job. And one other thing that happened, remember, we were already international. Our second acquisition actually was in London, also a statistics company and data management company, and eventually on the continent in Germany. And so by 1993, we were a fairly large, certainly by the then standards, organization, international, if not global. And we had raised a fair amount of money. And so these investors basically wanted liquidity. Yeah. And so we wrote the first S1. The S1 is basically a document you write to go public. The S1, since we were the first one, basically defined the industry for...
This is before your competitors.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct. We were the first company that was ready to go public. And as I said, we wrote the S1 together with our advisors. They were Goldman Sachs and, a law firm, a big law firm here in Boston. And so we were ready to go public in the first quarter of 1993, only to find that Bill Clinton had become president and Hillary Clinton was going to reorganize the entire healthcare system in the United States. And all our comparables dropped by 40%.
Wow.
And so we had to call off the IPO,
right?
Which was a big disappointment. And in any case, we regrouped. A year later, we tried again, changing the bank at this point to Kidder Peabody. Kidder Peabody went bankrupt on us as we were on the road.
You were fundraising.
Correct. And the reason why that happened was they had a rogue trader called Joe Chet.
Wow.
And this guy lost over $1 billion in rogue trading, and the entire company went down. And Kidder Peabody was really a white shoe, well-established, very prominent investment bank. And so it was, disheartening. Meanwhile, Quintiles also was ready to go public, and they actually went public before us and a very successful IPO in 94. So it was kind of galling, the whole experience.
How was that, before we go further, on a psychological level? You've been doing this by now 12, 13 years.
Yes, it was terrible.
Yeah.
It was really, the venture capitalists were disgusted. There is nothing on earth that is more ferocious than a venture capitalist who has his IPO taken away from him. I can tell you that. And so, and the people were disappointed, of course, as well. Yeah. So there's a big build-up and a big buzz that is, that exists, and when, for whatever reason, it doesn't whether it's your fault or anybody else's fault, doesn't really matter. The point is you didn't execute. So, but I want to get to the end. So in 95, eventually we tried one final time and had a fantastic IPO. We were oversubscribed by a factor of 10.
Wow.
And yet the new bank, William Blair, they were great and did a great job. And so we went public in November of 95. I was almost I was basically on my birthday. I was 41
Really?
years old. Yes.
That's a nice birthday.
Yeah, it was a nice birthday present. I still remember when we closed the deal. I took a limo on my way home,
Really?
and I was in that limo feeling great. I have to really say that. And
Take us that moment, just on a personal level.
Yeah.
This is the day that the IPO, the public
Yes,
because
actually the deal closed.
Yeah.
And the money actually came over the transom.
How psychologically, what did you think? How was that? Was it a sense of, I'm done here and I want to step back, or no, this is just the beginning of something a lot bigger?
It was mostly a feeling of accomplishment and of satisfaction and relief. Remember we are probably one of the very few companies that had 2 failed IPOs and lived to tell the tale.
Yeah.
And so, it was a watershed moment from that perspective. But I never really had, for me, it was a transition. It was never really an end point. I literally didn't stop a second. I went back to work the next morning and just kept trucking, because ultimately an IPO, whether people like it or not, is a fundraising event. That's it. And I always looked at fundraising as an obligation. People invest in you so that they get a return. It's not particularly, inspiring, but that's it. And it's a deal. It's a contract that you enter into as a business leader. I never had any illusions about that obligation.
Did you feel that, because obviously after that, Parexel exploded in size, was it easier by being public that certain things, contracts and...
The IPO made a big difference. I think until then, we were still viewed, kind of in a cagey way. Or is this real? Remember, clinical research and clinical trials, certainly at that time, were very big. We were basically in the blockbuster era. And so these were multi-year big commitments that pharma companies made. And I should say, by that time, we worked mainly, almost exclusively with the top 10 pharma companies. So from the mid-90s to the end of the 90s, we had essentially 10 customers. And they were essentially the top 10 pharma companies. And in order for them to really be comfortable, to be public, to have that transparency, accountability was really important. And also just the financial stability.
And obviously there's a difference between running a private company and a public company on the internal side. How did your relationship with the company change, if at all?
There was a big transition, but you have at that time, being a public company was different from today. So this was pre-Enron.
Right.
And one of the things that happened basically was, as a CEO of a public company, then especially as a founder CEO, you really were in charge. So your board basically was your board. So on day one, I changed out several board members. I mean, literally the next day, we changed out half our board. They were my appointees. I make no qualms about that. And so, I really felt probably the most in charge since we raised that first round of venture capital.
Wow.
This then all changed again when Enron came, and when all the regulatory changes came, Sarbanes-Oxley and so on. It completely changed to 180 degrees.
Fascinating. And in hindsight, were there any things that you could have done differently? Any mistakes you made in that period, or things that you reflect back on?
Parexel was always an innovative company. You can compete in different ways. One certainly of the most successful CROs was by their own definition a fast follower. They never really were on the cutting edge, let alone the bleeding edge. But we were always an innovator. So was Quintiles, by the way. And as an innovator, you make mistakes. In fact, by definition, you make experiments, and many of them fail. And so, there is a long history of failures, but also a long history of real innovations that drove the business forward. And when I say innovations, these are not new drugs, not that kind of innovation, but it's process innovation, business model innovation, information technology innovations. So we were the first company that brought IT really into the business. In fact, we started a separate entity eventually called Parexel Informatics. And we basically were by far, hands down, the leader in clinical research IT. When I say leader, global leader, unparalleled. And so, but this didn't come for free. There were many mistakes along the way.
But do you think, and I wanted to ask this earlier when you were speaking about the team that you put together. I mean, bringing people in, great people in is by far the most important skill, especially in the early days. Did you maintain that as you scale, that allowed to effectively rectify these mistakes and learn from them? Or how do you see that culture from the recruitment?
First of all, you're 100% right. It's literally all about people. And one other thing I have to say, as an entrepreneur, as startup entrepreneur, as a young startup entrepreneur, you I had to and wanted to bring in people from whom I could learn. I had to learn from somebody how to run a big company. This is not something that just sort of descends on you. And so there were several very important leadership transitions. I mean, intellectually, I realized that, but of course, there's always an emotional part to it and a loyalty part, which loyalty is very critically important in the early stages and probably always along the way, but you can't just be driven by loyalty. You have to kind of look at the hard facts and necessities of the moment in order to propel the company forward. And sometimes that really forces you to make very difficult decisions.
What was the hardest decision that you had to make?
Well, it was right in with what we just talked about. It was after the IPO, and we had a great run after the IPO. So by 97, 98, we were 4,000 people. We were a big organization, and I realized that this management team that we had that got us to that point, which was great, and they were loyal, they were committed, but I realized they will not get this company to the next level. They were essentially maxed out. Either they were burned out or just at capacity. And I still, to this day, remember when I had that hard talk with myself and I said, I have to change out these people. And I took a chart basically and mapped out, it's basically the top 50 people, and I realized I had to change out probably 35, 40 of them. And it was basically the saddest day of my career also.
To this date?
To this stage, because I love these people. Yeah. And they helped the company to get to that point, but we would have stagnated.
It reminds me of a famous story of Larry Ellison also in the early 90s when Oracle almost died, where the entire management had to be replaced or the company was, at least in his words, was going to die.
Yes. And so, those are, as I said, we were sort of at the end of what I would call the entrepreneurial phase, and we now were a big company. We were a big, global company, and the needs were different, and the needs and requirements and expectations of me were totally different. And you can either deliver that and make the hard decisions, or you have to take yourself out, and then somebody else is going to do it.
And how did you have that conversation when you did? Because that's a problem any leader faces. How do you have that conversation with someone where inside that this is the right thing to do? Do you just go straight into it?
Well, I think in many, you mean the discussion with the person or with yourself, or?
I guess that whole process. First, you have to decide that this is what you want to do. Then you have to, and then the execution of it. Who do you tell first? How do you communicate it? Is it just yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think the hardest part is actually to come to grips with it yourself. Mm. And, eventually I kind of developed a methodology almost, and, the point is you have to kind of stand in front of the mirror and say, I have to be this new guy. Can I do that? Do I really want to do that? Am I up for that? And, for the next phase of the company and knowing what needs to be done. And I think many people avoid that discussion with themselves.
Why do you think you were able to do that and some other leaders don't?
I don't know. I can't really give you a formula. I have to just tell you, this was not easy, really not easy at all. This happened basically, I would say, several times in my career.
Do you think family helps to contextualize things, or?
Family helps, your upbringing helps, your values help. I think one thing that happens is that leaders in this situation, they come to the point, they know they have to do this, and they start to then vilify their people. They basically say, the reason why I have to take them out or change is because they're bad. And that's not the case at all. And to make it easier for them, so to justify the deeds that they have to do. And that's bad. And so, to the contrary, you have to thank people and be supportive in that transition. And once you become a really good leader, you can do this very compassionately. Mm-hmm. And often people thank you because they are also suffering. They are, they're peaked out. They're at their capacity. As I said, they're burned out, and they're also afraid. because they're afraid to quit, or afraid that they lose their job, or they are frustrated that they're not able to deliver to the objectives and expectations. And in many cases, we did transitions. In other words, we took them out of front, top leadership position and maybe put them into another position. They were great people. They just were in the wrong job for the next phase. And we started to become very good at this at Parexel. I believe to this day that we had, the best people in the industry. And I can tell you to this day, the entire industry is seeded with talent from Parexel.
That's quite the quote, I have to say. And do you think that skill of, because and pharma is famous for doing reorgs after reorgs after reorgs, but doing a reorg well, putting the right people at the right places while maintaining a culture where people don't feel they're going to get fired. Is that something you feel you've developed a thesis that allowed Parexel to flourish?
Look, it's much easier, I have to say, if you want to use that word. It's never easy. These are the hardest decisions, the most difficult, most frustrating, most emotional decisions. But it is easier in a growing environment. Growth helps. Because as I said, when you grow, there are new opportunities. And so somebody, for instance, who is not great at bringing a process to the ultimate best is maybe very good over here in a more entrepreneurial environment that still existed in the company. We had several entrepreneurial efforts, like for instance, Parexel Informatics, I said, but we had others too. And so it was not really necessarily always a question of firing people at all. It was about taking their talent and hopefully finding a way to deploy those talents in a new way and in a better way. And sometimes that was not possible, but we even help people find jobs. In other words, it's, I think, especially as an entrepreneur, and therefore, you depend on the loyalty of your people, and that carries for me, and always did. And I think people also knew this. Okay, people also are realistic about this stuff, and it's a lot of it depends on how you do it. And when you see sometimes how kind of clinically, dispassionately that this is executed, I think that's certainly not how we did it.
There's so much more I could ask on that, but if we just go just a level higher, I mean, you were CEO for 35 years. 36 years. Sorry, that's just incredible. How do you see yourself, your leadership philosophy evolve over the time? I mean, you've touched a little bit on it, but I'm curious to see how you see yourself evolve over that time, and maybe reflect on it now.
Yeah, so I believe, this is business leadership. There are different, there's leadership in politics, there's leadership in academia, etc. So what I know about is business leadership and growth. And so first of all, I'd say people have this idea that growth essentially just happens. That's just not the case. Never was the case. You always make your own growth. And I always believed in order to grow, you need to have new ideas, you need to have innovation. And so what that basically meant was, eventually, as I kind of learned about this, you get to a plateau of your last strategy. It starts to peter out. Growth is not happening anymore, and you need to come with a new story. You need to find a new strategy. And eventually, we became very systematic about this. And so at that point, when that new strategy comes into focus, you have to stand in front of the mirror. And you basically have to say, as a leader, am I the person who is going to lead this organization through this next phase? Am I really the right person? Am I relevant? Am I willing to do what needs to be done? If not, you have to step aside. And I believe in many cases, leaders take their companies sideways because they're not willing to do that. They're not honest with themselves.
Fascinating. If you were to coach a pharma leader from today, how do you help them? How can someone external, a coach, help them see themselves in the mirror beyond just the skills? Is there something that you would say to someone that's 25 years old, 35, 45? How should someone go through that transition?
Well, if you look at S&P 500 companies, not surprisingly, the average tenure of a senior leader is 5-6 years now. And that is exactly one of those strategic increments. And so the way people have come to think about this is that they basically come up with a strategy and then they find a leader. So they basically don't assume that the incumbent can actually step up. And, look, the difference, of course, is that in many cases, these are old institutions. They have been around a long time. And it's actually difficult. It's, first of all, very difficult to do what I just described for the individual. Remember, you don't have to do that in many cases. In many cases, they are financially ready to transition. It's very hard to do this, because I always viewed myself as an athlete. And if you want to compete at the highest level, you have to be willing to do what athletes do every day. 100%. It's a total commitment. And so it's in many cases probably easier to bring in somebody from the outside to make those changes and, to make sure that next phase of growth can happen. And so, yeah, I'd have to say, if you build the company from the ground up, you have more of a connection. And, big pharma companies in particular are, in many cases, old institutions, and they don't have a founder. In some cases, they still have families involved, or they are basically almost nonprofits. They're owned by foundations, but they don't really have that influence. And so I don't know whether this would really carry into that world. What would be, however, really important is that they have strong talent management commitments. We eventually at Parexel, we had a policy that we wanted to be able to promote 60-70% in-house. And
is that still the case today?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not there anymore. But
sorry, in the industry in general, do you see that, or is that something that?
No, I don't believe that, because it's a big commitment and very expensive, and has an uncertain payoff. And so, today in the industry, it's much more transactional, basically, and the horizon, the investment horizon is 4 or 5 years, and a talent management strategy is a long-term strategy. It pays off over 10, 15 years. But it's amazing how powerful it is when it works.
So moving on from sort of the post-IPO, post-Enron scandal period, tell us about sort of the last 15 years that you were at Parexel.
Yeah. So remember, we kind of go back maybe to 2000. So in 97, 98, we were a public company, very wildly successful. I mean, we had 13 quarters in a row where we grew organically more than 50%.
Wow.
And we did acquisitions on top. And so, we were a transformed company by 1980, 1990. We then had a big crisis. The world had a big crisis around us. It was, basically the meltdown of the dot-com era. Right. The internet came. So, many changes, a little bit like today. It was a end of an era, beginning of an era. And the stocks and the attractiveness of CROs completely declined. So we went from peak market cap in the late 90s, 97, 98 of well over $1 billion, 1.4 billion, to less than cash on hand by 2000.
Wow.
Okay, so we had essentially a complete meltdown of our market cap. Many unhappy investors, people left. We had great people. They were attracted by these dot-coms, and so it was really a very trying time. And another thing that happened through the 90s. Remember, I was talking about the blockbuster era. So in the pharmaceutical industry, if you go back, the 90s were a very productive time. Many of the biggest drugs were developed at that time. They were blockbusters. They were basically the cash cows, including also a peak in approvals. So there were 60, 70 new medicinal entities approved by the FDA, a peak which we did not reach again as an industry until fairly recently.
Yep.
And so this then rolled over. And, the incremental dollar, if you want, moved out of R&D in big pharma into commercialization. They had to then basically launch these products. And so demand for our services declined or kind of, was tepid. And overnight, basically, we became a different kind of company. Until then, we were really a partner, and we basically helped, to get this huge load of work done for the industry. And overnight, we were supposed to be basically a cost-cutting kind of agent or factor. And we were completely not prepared for that. Mm-hmm. Not only did we have the best people, we had the best people in center city locations around the world. Our lineup of locations read like a perfume ad. We were in Berlin, we were in Paris, we were in London, we were in Boston, and in New York, in Tokyo, and these were all very expensive locations. And so it became clear to me that if we wanted to be successful, we had to completely change our footprint. We had to move. We had to get rid of these expensive locations. And so we did all that. We had many very difficult restructurings. But we basically moved most of our people from these center city locations into nearshoring locations. So here in Boston, for instance, we moved to Lowell. Lowell is a city about 40 miles away. The cost difference between Boston and Lowell is about 30-40%. Yeah. In the UK, we moved into the Midlands, cities like Manchester, Sheffield. We had a big location in Sheffield. Big drop-off in costs between London, city centre to Sheffield. And we also started to become very active in offshoring. Okay, so we started our India operation, China operation. And so, we really globalized the business and took advantage of the global footprint that we had in terms of getting our costs down. And that took several years. But eventually it really worked. And so we had a great run again in 2005, 2006, 2007. Another thing that also happened was that the cutting edge of pharmaceutical research moved into biotech. So this was a great era of biotech innovation, and biotech companies became really a factor. Remember, we were a big pharma shop, and so we had to really transform ourselves to become attractive to these companies, and we had to learn how to work with them. So going into the financial crisis, we were in great shape again, and the financial crisis was, again, a big reset for everybody.
I get a sense one of your super strengths is the ability to make a decision, convince yourself that this is a direction that has to go, and then relentlessly execute based on that without any doubt.
Never look down.
Never look down.
Never look down. Yeah. Once you make a decision, you move.
Yeah. Do you see other people struggle with that? Or
Totally.
Yeah.
You see, it's like I always picture myself being on north wall of a climbing wall. If you look down, you're dead. You look up all the time. That's your goal. Yeah. That's where you go.
Yeah.
If you start to be driven by fear, you're toast.
So tell us, so we're now post-financial crisis. I think you left Parexel in 2017. When did you start to think of transitioning, or was that something, how did that happen post the financial crisis?
Well, so the financial crisis was terrible for us for no particular real reason. It was just kind of, mental or emotional by the markets. But I still remember I went on a long Asia trip. By now all my trips became global, and I was always traveling a lot because we were in 100 countries. So you basically are continually somewhere. And I went on a long Asia trip. When I left, our stock price was $36. When I returned, it was $6 within 3 weeks. So it was a huge meltdown for no particular reason. As I said, nothing substantively, materially, nothing changed. And nothing changed really in the pharma industry.
And your conviction in direction was you did not get affected by the stock price?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but that's a more technical discussion. I don't know whether we want to get into that, but it had potentially difficult accounting and finance implications. But eventually we recovered from that, and it didn't really come into play, if you want. This happened to everybody. It didn't just happen to us. But what did change is we saw an opportunity and an openness to change the business model on how we dealt with our customers. And we did an innovation. Parexel invented or, basically mapped out how we could work truly strategically with pharma companies. And I think because of the financial crisis, they were ready to talk. And so within short order in 2010, 9, 10, 11, we became strategic partners with Pfizer, with Novartis, with many of these pharma companies. And we had a spectacular growth era. So organically, remember, we were now a big company. We had 12, 13,000 employees. And we grew organically, again, 25%. And so when a company like that grows 25%, it is really challenging. But we did well in the big scheme of things. I mean, it was a great era of growth. Like all strategies, this eventually peaked and started to peter out, just as I described before. And so that gets us sort of into 16. This, company stock price did great. Everything was great. But, the outlook was more tepid. And the environment there was, the political environment was that actually Hillary Clinton, who was my best friend, was running for president again. And remember, she was going to win 100%. Nobody believed that would not be the case. And her enemy number one, declared enemy, was the pharmaceutical industry. And so in anticipation of that, there were many restructurings, a little bit like today, and it affected us very strongly. So there were huge cancellations. In one quarter in 2016, $1 billion worth of our backlog dropped out. And so this was huge, absolutely huge. Even though we had $6 billion of backlog, but this is very difficult to overcome. And so we started to have layoffs. We basically had to adjust for that. It was not totally clear how this was going to move forward. And we attracted activists, shareholder activists. And so, that basically had a lot to do with our decision.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's funny how that didn't end up actually happening, the election.
Yes, it turned out differently, of course, but the activists stayed. These are ankle biters. Once they basically get a hold of you, they don't let go. And as people go in my career that I have dealt with, I would say they are probably at the bottom as a category of people I don't respect.
Yeah.
Basically, I think they're zero value added. And I really didn't have a lot of appetite to spend the rest of my career, ditzing around with these kinds of people.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, of course. And well, after Parexel, you didn't quite slow down. You've been involved in a number of ventures, and you're an investor yourself.
I'll make one point though. It was not just my decision. It was a board decision. And in fact, every one of our competitors by then had been private and public also. And we felt that the changes that the company had to make were better executed in a private environment. Because as I said, we had to restructure. We had, we wanted to spin out Parexel Informatics, and so there was a lot of kind of big changes that needed to happen. And we saw that the competitors that went private actually did quite well, and many of them became public again. And so it was not just my decision, or it was not, by that time, as I said, we were a big company. We had a very professional board, and it was really the board's decision.
Because in 2017, the company went private.
2017, the company went private. It was acquired by a private equity firm. And they pretty much executed many of the changes that we had envisaged. I still stayed with the company. Mm-hmm. I was still CEO actually for a year after it was acquired, and chairman for a year and a half. And so it was a very good transition. Actually, I thought it was a great decision. The time was right. For me personally, the time was right also, because nothing lasts forever, and 36 years is a long time.
Were there certain things you wanted to do that after you left. I mean, firstly, psychologically, how is that to leave after so long? What do you do?
Well, it's another one. It's a life decision, of course. But the point is, we all get to that point. When you're young, you don't really see that. But, once you get to be, a certain age, that eventually things end. By the way, just to let you know, none of us gets out of here alive, So basically, this becomes more kind of front of mind, but what we do have is an opportunity to direct or influence the way you exit. Okay. And so I saw many people with really bad exits. And I basically swore that would not happen to me. And so I had a very good succession plan at Parexel, ready to be executed. I was basically ready to move on anyway, also psychologically, knowing that this would eventually happen. And, people who fight this eventually have bad experiences and they have bad consequences. That decision has bad consequences for the companies. And I didn't really want that to happen. And so I wouldn't say necessarily, if I had been 20 years younger, I probably would have not felt the same way. But I certainly was ready for that transition at the time.
And tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing since.
Yeah, so since then, I regrouped. I also became a grandfather, which is sort of another stage of life. I have now 4 grandsons, which is great. And, just...
More time, man. No longer 100 countries to visit.
Yeah. Right. So this is really, terrific. In many ways, I spend more time with them than I spent with my own sons, because I was just on the road all the time. And so this is really, I really cherish this, this privilege. And also, I still believe, I'm healthy and, and energetic, basically. And so, again, I never really missed a beat. Basically, after Parexel, I took an office, which I still have, and I've joined several companies in board positions. So I'm chairman of 2 companies. I'm on the board of several others. I'm on the board of a couple of nonprofits, now one, a nonprofit organization, which I really also enjoy. So, you have more. You're not the driver anymore. You're not in the driver's seat, but you're still able to support, the destiny of mainly smaller companies or bigger companies for that matter. But the way it now has ended, the way it has worked out for me is that I have worked with a number of PE firms. I'm a senior advisor at General Atlantic, a great PE firm. I didn't really know what to expect from these PE folks, but my experience has been really great. Pamplona was actually a very good company. They acquired Parexel. I believe they were completely above board and lived up to the T of their commitments.
Wow.
And I have now been a senior advisor at General Atlantic, and I would say the same of them. They are a great company, great culture, really exceeding my expectations. So I enjoy working with them, and looking. We basically started a life sciences franchise there, and so it was a very good experience.
Wow. So looking more at the industry as a whole, clinical trials today look very different than in 1982. How do you see, when you look back then and now, the good, the bad, what should change?
So clinical trials in the 90s were big undertakings. Remember we had these blockbuster products. Clinical trials were potentially huge. You had thousands of patients, global studies, and the technology, the pharmaceutics technology has really changed. So generally, what this meant is that we have moved more into smaller diseases, meaning we broke down the disease categories. So if you take hypertension, so we have products for hypertension, but hypertension is not really the disease. It's not the underlying cause. And so with today's biotechnologies mainly, you can really go to the root of the problem, but it basically shrinks the markets. And so trials have become smaller. It's harder to find those patients. They are often also potentially more sick, because you're now, at the point where, where the disease really originates. And also, on the other side, we have much more technology. Remember, when we started, everything was still on paper.
And telex.
Not far away from the telex. You had fax. I mean, a lot of it, and all those AIDS trials heavily use faxes as kind of its prime technology. And so, the way this, for a long time, the way this worked was you basically had a case report form, a questionnaire. You got the patient data. This had to be manually re-input into some kind of system. And over time, this streamlined and, EDC, electronic data capture, became the norm. And so in today's world, you're much more technologically enabled. And I still see a huge upside for all of this, for information technology. The main reason basically being is that clinical research, and I guess all research, but certainly clinical research, essentially is a data exercise. This has not really been maxed out yet and fully taken advantage of, and I think we're still on that journey.
Are there specific low-hanging fruits where you still think, like, I thought this problem should have been fixed by now?
Well, do you know how long it took until we got rid of paper? The last trial at Parexel that still had paper was in 2017. Okay? So this has a long tail, because you cannot underestimate, that you basically have to essentially cater to the lowest common denominator, which is to say, in global trials, here in Boston, you can essentially run a virtual trial, but if you have a site in Kenya or in, any of these countries, it has to be effective there too. And for all intents and purposes, you have to use the same platform. When we started to do clinical trials in the East, meaning Eastern Europe, we had to bring printers, fax machines, computers to the doctors. They had nothing. And, investigators now have a certain amount of technology, but you cannot take the standard of London or Boston and assume that that's global. That's just not the case. And so change is happening slowly, and it's basically from the bottom up. And this will continue to be the case. I will say one other thing, though. One big change that also happened, and that is really very important, is that if you kind of look at the era which I'm describing, the wall came down in Europe in, the end of the Cold War. It was, 1990, 1989. We put our biggest European investment immediately into Berlin. Because if you look at the world in Europe, the center of Europe is Berlin, not the West. We have, we generally sort of have a Western point of view, but, Berlin is really at the center of this. And this worked out really great, because we became a leader of clinical research in the East, all the way into Russia. And we were welcome everywhere. We trained people. In fact, we had a contract with the Russian government to train investigators in Russia. Big contract. I met the Minister of Health in Russia, and they welcomed us in all of those countries. We had a big contingent of people in Ukraine and in all those Eastern European countries and in the rest of the world. And I would say from about 2015 forward, this really has started to change. The cold wind of nationalism has started to come back. And, for a global enterprise like clinical research, this is really detrimental. And it will be more difficult to execute efficient clinical trials in this environment. And I don't really know exactly what the endpoint is, or kind of the apex of this trend. But I can tell you it's very difficult, very different from what we experienced. So in my career, my 36 years, I had the luck, basically, of walls coming down, barriers coming down, global harmonization happening, global standards being adopted. And we were riding that wave, and we were actually a driver of this trend.
That's quite fascinating to look at it that way. Now we have to talk about AI these days. What's your take on what you know from a business perspective on the impact that AI can have? And is the CRO model under threat potentially?
I think AI is a very important technology. I liken it in some ways to the emergence of the internet. So it's basically a sea change. Having said that, and as I told you before, every technology that ever came to clinical research, including the internet, was a slow bleed in. It was never revolutionary. And I think this will be no different here. I believe there are many use cases. And I remember I told you I'm involved with, very innovative companies, startup companies. And, I see what they do and what's available and what the thinking is and kind of I think the same will happen. I think AI eventually will play a very big role in clinical research, but it's not going to happen overnight. This will be a slow uptake. And these use cases have to be proven out slowly, cautiously, and when the regulators are cautious, and because remember, one other thing that people always forget with information technology, we tend to emphasize the strong and the good and the obvious, but we forget that the potential for fraud and the ease of fraud also goes up. In a totally virtual world, you could also make up stuff fairly easily. And so especially from a regulator's perspective, you have to always guard against that. And, you have to put basically audits and controls in place that allow you to really see the truth, because a lot is at stake here. This is not just money. It's not just like any other commodity. Really, people's lives are at stake.
In that context, how would you describe the role and the challenges of today's regulatory agencies from China to the US?
Well, as I said, as part of this globalization that I talked about and, the ease with which we moved, the FDA was really, I say standards were adopted. They were mainly FDA standards at the end of the day. China, for instance, didn't make a huge leap. They didn't even call their agency any different. It was called SFDA. That's it. And Japan originally had its own standards, which were sort of semi-scientific in my non-scientific description. And they changed their standards, essentially adopting FDA standards. And, there was the global harmonization of clinical research practices sometime in the late 90s. And so basically there's now a lot of blowback against that, and so, these jurisdictions want to assert their own ideas and their own standards. And the US is also pulling back to some extent, because this being a leader in all of this is also not easy and free and is expensive. And, so I don't know exactly what the new world order is going to be, but it's not going to be as basically, if you want, comfortable for a global developer as it was in the past. That I'm sure of.
Yeah. So as we're nearing to the end of the episode, I'd love to ask you a couple of short questions and you give me a short answer, a quick rapid fire. What is one piece of advice you'd give yourself in 1982?
I think one of the things that I now realize, at the time, I thought this was going to be basically a relatively quick experience. I start this company, I transact this company and I do something else. And when you start a company, probably any company and certainly this kind of a company, this is really a life commitment. I have to say that was really a hard-won realization. And I would advise myself to be aware of that and also to be aware, that this is your life, okay? This is not a rehearsal, and to be really reconciled with that, and it would probably help you make some of the trade-offs better than when you don't know that.
What was the hardest decision you ever made as CEO?
Well, it's what we talked about before. I think these people decisions are the hardest decisions. And especially when it affects people who are great, were great, were loyal, and you still have to make the changes. That's very tough.
Is there a book that had the biggest impact on you?
In line with what we talked about before, one of the books that really resonated with me and really kind of gave me, a boost was, Tom Friedman, the world is flat. For us, for a long time, the world really was flat.
Wow. What's one thing most people misunderstand about the CRO industry?
Well, many people don't really understand the pivotal role that this industry is playing. So I would actually claim that the biotech industry, as we know today, would not exist without CROs. The original idea of biotech basically was that they would be basically research companies. And indeed they were. They had to license their products, usually right out of the lab. And to be able to virtually develop a product all the way through commercialization is astounding. And a huge value added for the innovators, for the biotech innovators, and for the biopharma innovators. And I think people are not really aware of that. As you said at the very beginning of this discussion, people sort of take it for granted that this exists. But think about it. What would the world be like if this didn't exist? It would be amazingly more difficult and poor, really. And so CROs up and down the value chain now, there are CROs all the way from discovery to commercialization, play a critical role. And, just to belabor this point, I know it's supposed to be short answers, but I really kind of want to make this point. One big and maybe one of the biggest achievements that the CRO industry brought about was that we exposed these activities to the market. Before, people could just declare and say, we're great at clinical research. Well, says who? How do you measure that? Today, this is a highly visible, transparent, competitive environment. And if you make a mistake or if you are too expensive, your competitor is going to do it better, faster, cheaper. And so, we were able as an industry to achieve that transparency. And, as you know, this is now a multi-$100 billion industry. And, to be able to say that, I think is an achievement.
I don't know where to start, but you've had an absolutely incredible career. And it's been, I don't know how to describe how incredibly useful it is to share this, both for me, humbling to learn about all these things. But if you had to sum up your experience in 3 words, how would you describe that?
That's not a lot, 3 words. Well, I don't know that I can do it in 3 words, but I would say a key word in all of this is grit. Success in entrepreneurship is tenacity. You have to stick with it. Everything takes longer. Everything is harder than you ever thought and costs more than you ever thought. And that's point 1. Point 2, along with that, you have to believe in yourself. Along the lines we discussed now here, it's that you can't look down. You can't be driven by fear. You have to expect that it's hard. It will be. I used to have a joke. The joke was, we live in the Arctic, and occasionally there is an Arctic summer where things are really cool and nice and everybody procreates, but that lasts 2 months and then it's winter again and hard. And that's what you sign up for.
Well, yeah. Is there any particular leader that you've taken inspiration from? Certainly not Hillary Clinton, I assume.
Well, sadly, Hillary Clinton crossed my path, indirectly. I don't know her personally, but she crossed my path in an unfortunate way for me a couple of times. So no. Well, there are obviously several business leaders, but I have never really been driven by idols. This is not. I mean, ultimately, I take my inspirations from opportunities. I think the biggest asset, the most valuable thing you can have is an opportunity. And I always felt, that's you have to deliver against an opportunity. You can't waste an opportunity. And that is what was a big driver for me versus, kind of an idol that I wanted to emulate.
Okay, that's a great answer. And my last question is, if you had to give a piece of advice to leaders in the pharmaceutical industry today, what would that be?
I think that the pharmaceutical industry still is not capitalizing on the great good that it does. I think I don't know why, but they still are relatively awkward about their own story. I believe that, the amount of lives that are saved through the pharmaceutical industry, the big impact on healthcare costs to the good that these therapies allow, the extension of quality of life that people have with diseases is amazing. And this should be the easiest story to tell on earth. Instead, the popularity of the pharmaceutical industry is worse than tobacco companies. So there has to be something that is awry here. How can you take such a fantastic story and bury it like that? It's unclear to me. And by the way, this is not new news, but I never understood this. And I would, if I had the chance, I would really work on this. I think the public doesn't really get this. They don't see this cause and effect.
Well, with those inspirational words, Joe, thank you so much for being on the episode. Is there any final message that you'd like to share before we wrap up the episode?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity. It's been an absolute blast to talk to you. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Dankeschön.